I'm telling you this story 6 months after it began. From my own kitchen table in the house, my daughter had planned to renovate and sell. The irony isn't lost on me that I was once considered too mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. Yet here I am, speaking to you with perfect clarity about events that would make most people question everything they believe about family loyalty. 6 months ago, I was living in room 237 at Sunset Manor, a place I never imagined I'd call home at 72. My name is Vivian Catherine Morrison, and 6 months ago, I controlled a real estate empire worth $47 million. I built that fortune over 4 decades, starting with a single duplex I bought with my late husband's life insurance money. Property by property, renovation by renovation, I created something substantial. Something that would ensure my family's security for generations. Today, I don't control so much as the temperature in my own room. The woman responsible for this dramatic change in my circumstances is my daughter, Catherine Elizabeth Morrison Hayes. 51 years old, Stanford MBA, corporate attorney specializing in elder law. She's brilliant, successful, and utterly convinced that she saved me from myself. Catherine began her campaign 15 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. It started with concerned phone calls about my increasing forgetfulness. Had I remembered to pay the property taxes? Was I taking my medications correctly? Perhaps I should consider getting some help around the house. The calls became visits. The visits became interventions. She brought charts showing my allegedly declining cognitive function. Medical articles about the dangers of financial exploitation of the elderly, and increasing urgency about my need for protection. I want you to understand something crucial. I was not declining. Yes, I occasionally misplaced my reading glasses or forgot someone's name at the grocery store. I'm 72, not 27. But my mind remained sharp, my business decisions sound, and my independence intact. Catherine saw it differently, or perhaps more accurately, Catherine chose to see it differently. The first major red flag came when she suggested I give her power of attorney just for emergencies. When I declined, she became agitated in a way I'd never seen before. She spoke about her fears, her sleepless nights worrying about me, the terrible stories she'd heard about elderly people being taken advantage of by strangers. "Mom," she said, sitting in my kitchen with tears in her eyes, "I can't live with myself if something happens to you because I didn't do enough to protect you." It was masterfully done. How do you argue against a daughter's love and concern? How do you explain that her protection feels like suffocation without seeming ungrateful, or, worse, proving her point about your declining judgment? The second red flag was the family meeting she organized. My son David flew in from Seattle. My sister Margaret came down from Sacramento, and Catherine presented what she called documentation of Mom's concerning behaviors. She had photographs of my cluttered desk, recordings of me repeating a story I'd told her the week before, and a detailed timeline of what she termed incidents. The incident where I'd gotten confused about which pharmacy I'd transferred my prescriptions to became evidence of dangerous medication mismanagement. The afternoon I'd spent looking for my car keys became proof of memory issues affecting my safety. The fact that I'd hired a new accountant after my previous one retired became suspicious financial decision-making. By the end of that meeting, even I was beginning to question myself. Catherine had a way of presenting normal aging behaviors as symptoms of something sinister. She spoke with such authority, such detailed concern, that disagreeing with her felt like denying obvious reality. But the most devastating moment came when she produced a letter from Dr. Harrison, my longtime physician, recommending a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. What she didn't mention was that she'd scheduled and attended my last 3 appointments with him. steering every conversation toward her concerns about my mental state. The evaluation was humiliating. Hours of tests designed to measure my capacity, my judgment, my ability to manage complex decisions. I passed most of them. But the examiner noted my increased anxiety and defensive responses to questions about family support. Of course I was defensive. My own daughter was systematically dismantling my autonomy while positioning herself as my savior. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in March. Catherine arrived with 2 men in suits and a folder full of legal documents. She'd petitioned the court for conservatorship based on the medical evaluation and Dr. Harrison's recommendation. The judge had granted it. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, and I could see she meant it. "But I can't stand by and watch you make decisions that could destroy everything you've worked for." Within 48 hours, I was at Sunset Manor. Catherine had arranged everything: the facility, the room, the care plan. She'd even packed my belongings, carefully selecting which personal items would be appropriate for my new simplified lifestyle. The cruelest part wasn't the loss of my home or my business. It was the way she'd convinced everyone, including herself, that this was an act of love rather than betrayal. But here's what Catherine doesn't know. What she couldn't have anticipated in all her careful planning. I saw this coming long before she made her move. Have you ever watched someone you love transform into someone you don't recognize? Catherine wasn't the first person in our family to use medical concerns as a weapon. If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. Recognition is the first step toward protection. Because the truth about family patterns runs much deeper than anyone imagines. And some lessons can only be learned when you're forced to face the mirror of your own past actions. The will Catherine is so eager to execute contains more than just financial instructions. It contains the story of how I learned to do exactly what she's doing now, 37 years ago, to my own mother. Let me tell you exactly how Catherine executed her plan. Because understanding her methods might help you recognize them in your own family before it's too late. The first phase was what I now call evidence collection. For 6 months, Catherine documented every minor lapse, every moment of ordinary human forgetfulness, every decision that didn't align with her judgment. She kept a notebook. I found it later in her purse, with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of what she labeled concerning incidents. March 15th. Mom couldn't remember if she'd locked the front door. Went back to check 3 times during our walk. April 2nd. Found Mom's medication organizer still full on Tuesday afternoon. She insisted she'd taken her morning pills, but couldn't explain why they were still there. April 20th. Mom paid the landscaper twice for the same job. When I pointed it out, she became agitated and accused me of treating her like a child. Reading these entries later, I could see how normal behaviors had been reframed as symptoms. Yes, I'd checked the door multiple times. I was going out of town for a week and wanted to be certain. Yes, my medication organizer was full on Tuesday. I'd filled it for the week, but decided to take my pills directly from the bottles that day. And yes, I'd paid the landscaper twice. But I'd also caught the error myself, and resolved it before Catherine even knew about it. But in Catherine's notebook, these became a pattern of cognitive decline, requiring immediate intervention. The second phase was expert validation. Catherine accompanied me to every medical appointment for 8 months, positioning herself as my primary advocate and source of information about my daily functioning. She'd arrive early to speak privately with Dr. Harrison, outlining her concerns and providing her documented evidence. During the appointments, she'd interrupt my responses to clarify or correct them. When Dr. Harrison asked how I was managing my medications, Catherine would say, "She's been having some trouble with that. Haven't you, Mom? Before I could answer, when he inquired about my daily activities, she'd add, she's been more isolated lately, spending a lot of time alone in the house. Each interruption was framed as loving support, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Dr. Harrison began to see me through Catherine's lens of concern, rather than his own observations of my actual capabilities. The third phase was family consensus building. Catherine strategically shared her concerns with my son David and my sister Margaret, but she didn't present them as opinions. She presented them as medical facts requiring family action. Dr. Harrison is worried about Mom's safety living alone, she told David. Not, I think Mom might need help, but the doctor says she's at risk. The cognitive evaluation shows definite decline, she informed Margaret. Not, there were some areas of concern, but the test proves she can't make sound decisions anymore. By the time of the family meeting, Catherine had already convinced everyone that intervention was necessary. The meeting wasn't about whether to act, but about how quickly and decisively to move forward. The fourth phase was legal positioning. While building her medical case, Catherine was simultaneously consulting with elder law attorneys about conservatorship procedures. She learned exactly what documentation would be required, which medical professionals carried the most weight with judges, and how to present her case as urgent protection rather than family conflict. She timed everything perfectly. The petition was filed on a Friday afternoon, when most attorneys' offices were closed for the weekend. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving me only 3 business days to respond. She knew I'd struggle to find legal representation on such short notice, especially when the case painted me as mentally incompetent. The fifth phase was fait accompli. By the time I understood what was happening, Catherine had already secured the conservatorship, arranged my placement at Sunset Manor, and begun transferring control of my financial assets. She presented each step as inevitable, the natural consequence of medical necessity, rather than her deliberate choices. I wish there were another way, Mom, she said as we toured Sunset Manor together. But Dr. Harrison says this is what's best for you right now. She'd made sure that every authority figure, medical, legal, institutional, supported her narrative. Disagreeing with Catherine meant disagreeing with medical expertise and family consensus. It meant appearing uncooperative, delusional, or worse. What made Catherine's approach so effective was her genuine belief in her own righteousness. She wasn't consciously manipulating the system. She was using it exactly as designed. Elder law exists to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation and harm. Catherine simply expanded the definition of vulnerability to include any decision-making that didn't align with her judgment. The most insidious part was how she'd made my resistance to her control into evidence of my need for it. When I objected to her involvement in my medical appointments, she cited my paranoia about family support. When I insisted on maintaining my independence, she documented my denial about safety limitations. When I became frustrated with her constant surveillance, she recorded my inappropriate emotional responses to reasonable concerns. Catherine had created a perfect catch-22. Accepting her control meant admitting incompetence, but resisting her control proved incompetence. Either way, she won. But here's what Catherine didn't anticipate. She wasn't the first person in our family to discover this particular power dynamic. She wasn't the first to realize that medical concern could be weaponized for financial control. She wasn't even the first to convince herself that taking someone's autonomy was actually an act of love. I recognized her methods because I'd used them myself, decades earlier, on someone who trusted me completely. If you're watching an adult child become increasingly concerned about an aging parent's capacity, pay attention to the patterns described here. Sometimes protection is love. but sometimes protection is control. The difference lies in who benefits from the decisions being made. Have you seen these dynamics in your own family? Your awareness might prevent someone else's loss of autonomy. Because what Catherine found in my will wasn't just financial instructions. It was the story of how I'd learned these same techniques 37 years ago, when I convinced everyone that my own mother needed saving from herself. I need to tell you about my mother, Margaret Rose Morrison, because understanding what I did to her is the only way you'll understand what Catherine learned from me. In 1987, my mother was 74 years old and living in the same house where she'd raised me and my sister. She was a widow of 12 years, fiercely independent, and showing the first signs of what we'd now call mild cognitive impairment. She repeated stories, occasionally forgot appointments, and had developed an unfortunate habit of giving money to every charity that called her on the phone. I was 48 then, the same age Catherine is now. I had 2 teenagers, a husband starting his own business, and mounting financial pressures that kept me awake at night. My mother, meanwhile, was sitting on assets worth nearly $200,000, her house, savings, and my father's pension funds, while making what I considered increasingly poor financial decisions. The charity giving was my first justification for intervention. Mother had donated nearly $3,000 in 6 months to organizations with names like Disabled Veterans Relief Fund and Children's Cancer Research Foundation. When I investigated, I discovered these were mostly telemarketing scams, preying on elderly donors. "Mom," I said, reviewing her bank statements in her kitchen, "you can't keep giving money to every sad story you hear on the phone. These people are taking advantage of you. I can spend my money however I choose." "Vivian," she replied with dignity, "I've lived through the Depression and 2 wars. I know the value of helping people in need." But I'd already decided that her judgment was compromised. The evidence was right there in her checkbook, donation after donation to questionable causes. Late fees on utility bills she'd forgotten to pay, duplicate purchases when she'd forgotten about previous orders. Sound familiar? I began my campaign the same way Catherine began hers, with loving concern and careful documentation. I started visiting more frequently, ostensibly to help with household tasks, but actually to observe and record instances of what I labeled poor decision-making. I found expired food in her refrigerator and documented it as evidence of safety concerns. I noticed mail piling up on her dining room table and interpreted it as inability to manage important correspondence. When she mentioned forgetting whether she'd taken her evening medication, I suggested a pill organizer and began monitoring her compliance, just like Catherine would do to me 37 years later. The difference was that in 1987, there was less awareness about elder abuse and fewer legal protections for aging adults. But the underlying dynamics were identical. An adult child positioning herself as the expert on her parents' capacity, using genuine but minor concerns to justify major interventions. I convinced my sister Margaret that our mother needed more support. I spoke with Mother's doctor about my observations and concerns, framing them as medical issues requiring professional intervention. I researched power of attorney requirements and elder care options, all while maintaining that I only wanted what was best for her. The turning point came when Mother had a minor car accident. She'd backed into a mailbox in the grocery store parking lot, causing scratches to her bumper and $50 in damage. No one was hurt, and Mother reported the incident appropriately to her insurance company. But I saw opportunity in crisis. "Mom, this accident is a warning sign," I said the next day. "What if next time it's not a mailbox? What if it's a child?" She protested that it was a minor mishap, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. but I'd already scheduled an appointment with her doctor to discuss her declining driving safety and contacted a geriatric specialist about comprehensive cognitive evaluation. The evaluation showed mild memory issues consistent with normal aging, but also noted what the specialist called family concerns about functional capacity. When Mother became frustrated during testing, it was documented as resistance to assessment and possible insight limitations. I convinced Mother to give me power of attorney by presenting it as a temporary measure, just until she recovered from the stress of the accident and evaluation. I promised it was only for emergencies, only to help with complicated financial tasks she shouldn't have to worry about. Within 6 months, I was managing all her finances. Within a year, I'd convinced her to sell the house and move to a senior living community, where she'd have more support and social opportunities. Mother lived at Heritage Gardens for 3 years before passing away from pneumonia. They were good years in many ways. She made friends, participated in activities, and seemed content with her simplified lifestyle. But she never got her autonomy back. She never returned to making her own decisions about her money, her living situation, or her daily schedule. I told myself I'd saved her from financial exploitation and safety risks. I convinced myself that her contentment at Heritage Gardens proved I'd made the right choice. I believed I was a good daughter who'd protected her mother from the dangers of aging independence. But I was lying to myself, just like Catherine is lying to herself now. The truth was that I'd wanted Mother's money, not all of it, not in some dramatic inheritance grab, but access to it when my own family faced financial pressure. The power of attorney allowed me to borrow funds for my husband's business ventures, to use her savings to cover unexpected expenses in our lives. I always intended to pay it back. I always justified it as temporary assistance that she'd want to provide if she understood our circumstances. But the debt grew larger, and the justifications became more elaborate. And eventually, I needed her to remain in care because I couldn't afford to give her back control of finances I'd already spent. The most devastating part wasn't what I took from her. It was what I taught my daughter Catherine by watching me do it. Catherine was 17 when I moved her grandmother to Heritage Gardens. She watched me handle Mother's resistance with patient explanations about safety and medical necessity. She observed how I positioned myself as the responsible adult making difficult but necessary decisions. She learned that love could look like control, that protection could justify taking someone's choices away. When you look at family patterns, how far back do they really go? Sometimes the behaviors we judge in others are ones we learned from ourselves. If you're recognizing uncomfortable parallels in this story, you're not alone. The first step toward breaking cycles is acknowledging they exist. Catherine didn't invent the tactics she used on me. She perfected them. She applied lessons I'd unknowingly taught her about how caring daughters handle aging mothers who can't be trusted to make their own decisions. And now, sitting in room 237 at Sunset Manor, I understand exactly what my mother felt during those final years of her life. The helplessness, the frustration, the complicated grief of losing your agency to someone who genuinely believes they're acting out of love. But I also understand something Catherine doesn't know yet. The power of strategic patience and the devastating impact of forcing someone to see their own reflection in a mirror they can't look away from. The moment I truly understood what was happening came on a Thursday afternoon in April. 3 weeks after Catherine had me committed to Sunset Manor, she was sitting in the visitor's chair next to my bed, explaining why she'd decided to renovate my house before putting it on the market. "The kitchen needs updating, Mom," she said, scrolling through contractor estimates on her tablet, "and the master bathroom is completely outdated. If we invest about $30,000 in improvements, we can probably get an additional $50,000 to $60,000 in sale price." She spoke with such casual authority about my home, my possessions, my future, that for a moment I forgot I was the one who'd bought that house, who'd chosen every fixture and paint color, who'd raised my children within those walls. "Don't you think you should ask me before making those decisions?" I said quietly. Catherine looked up from her tablet with genuine confusion. "Mom, we discussed this. You're not able to handle these kinds of complex financial decisions anymore. That's why I have conservatorship." And in that moment, I heard my own voice from 37 years earlier, explaining to my mother why I was selling her house. "Mother, you can't manage property maintenance anymore. The house is too big, too expensive, too complicated for someone in your condition. This is what's best for you." The words were nearly identical. The tone of patient authority, the assumption that I knew better than she did about her own needs. The way I'd made her displacement sound like protection. Catherine had learned it all from watching me. But recognition was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, I began to see the full scope of what I'd taught her. When Catherine discussed my confusion about financial matters with the Sunset Manor staff, I remembered explaining my mother's poor judgment to the Heritage Gardens administrator. When she described my resistance to help as a symptom of cognitive decline, I heard myself telling Mother's doctor about her denial about safety limitations. Catherine had even adopted my specific language patterns. She spoke about what's best for Mom the same way I'd spoken about what's best for Mother. She positioned every decision as medical necessity rather than personal choice, just as I had done. She'd learned to weaponize compassion so effectively that even I almost believed her concern was purely altruistic. But the most devastating recognition came when I understood that Catherine's financial motivations weren't conscious greed. They were learned justification patterns. Just as I'd told myself that borrowing Mother's money was temporary assistance for legitimate family needs, Catherine was telling herself that controlling my assets was prudent protection of family resources. She genuinely believed she was being responsible, preventing me from making poor decisions that would diminish the inheritance she'd eventually receive anyway. The logic was identical to mine 30 years earlier. If the money would ultimately be hers, why not secure it now before I could waste it on unnecessary expenses or fall victim to scams? Why not use it strategically for improvements that would benefit the entire family? Catherine wasn't consciously stealing from me any more than I'd consciously stolen from my mother. We were both operating within a framework of justified control that disguised self-interest as protection. This recognition led to a period of devastating self-reflection. For weeks, I could barely eat or sleep as I confronted the reality of what I'd done to my mother and what I'd inadvertently taught my daughter to do to me. I'd spent years believing I was a good daughter who'd made difficult but necessary decisions about Mother's care. I'd attended her funeral with clear conscience, confident that I'd given her the best possible final years given her limitations. But now, I understood that Mother's limitations had been largely constructed by me, just as my current limitations had been constructed by Catherine. We'd both been subjected to loving daughters who'd convinced everyone, including themselves, that taking our autonomy was an act of protection rather than control. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something else: strategic clarity. I realized that Catherine would continue this pattern indefinitely, unless something forced her to confront her own behavior. As long as she could maintain the narrative that she was protecting me from myself, she'd never question whether her protection was actually control. But I had something Catherine didn't expect: the advantage of experience and the luxury of time to plan. While she was busy managing my assets and making decisions about my care, I was analyzing her methods and developing a response that would force her to see herself clearly. I couldn't undo what I'd done to my mother, but I could prevent Catherine from continuing the cycle with her own children. The will I'd written months before her intervention suddenly became my primary weapon. Not for revenge. Revenge would have been emotionally satisfying but educationally useless. Instead, I began crafting an experience that would teach Catherine exactly what I'd learned too late. That the person you become when you take someone's choices away isn't the person you want to be. I spent hours in my room at Sunset Manor, writing and rewriting the document that Catherine would eventually read. Not just the legal provisions about my assets, but the letter explaining why those provisions existed. The letter that would force her to see herself in the mirror of my own past actions. Because I understood something about family patterns that Catherine didn't yet know. They continue until someone has the courage to break them, even when breaking them requires admitting your own complicity in creating them. Have you ever recognized your own behavior in someone else's actions and realized you didn't like what you saw? Family patterns often repeat because we teach them without realizing we're teaching them. Recognition is painful, but it's also the only path toward change. What patterns in your family might be worth examining? The letter Catherine would find wouldn't just reveal my past, it would force her to choose her future. She could continue the pattern of justified control that I'd modeled for her. Or she could become the person who finally broke a cycle that had been damaging our family for generations. But first, she had to understand exactly what that cycle was and how she'd learn to perpetuate it. She had to see herself clearly, which meant she had to see me clearly first. Catherine discovered the letter on a gray Tuesday morning in October, 7 months after she'd had me committed. She'd arrived at the offices of Patterson and Associates, my longtime attorneys, with her typical confidence and detailed preparation, ready to execute what she assumed would be a straightforward transfer of assets to her control. I wasn't present for the reading, but Mr. Patterson called me that afternoon to describe what had transpired. His voice carried a mixture of professional discretion and barely contained amazement at the document I'd crafted. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "I've been practicing estate law for 32 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you've done. Your daughter left here in a state I can only describe as psychological shock. The will itself was legally straightforward. My assets would be distributed according to traditional inheritance structures, with Catherine receiving the majority of my estate upon my death. But attached to the will was a sealed letter with specific instructions that it must be read aloud in Catherine's presence before any discussion of asset distribution could proceed." Mr. Patterson had opened the letter that morning and read it exactly as I'd requested. With Catherine sitting across from his desk in the burgundy leather chair where I'd sat months earlier, planning this moment. The letter began simply. "My dear Catherine, if you are hearing this letter, then you have successfully gained control of my finances and my life. Decisions through the same methods I used to gain control of your grandmother's finances and life decisions 37 years ago. Before you claim your inheritance, you need to understand exactly what you have inherited." According to Mr. Patterson, Catherine's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. She'd interrupted the reading to ask what I meant about her grandmother, explaining that my mother had needed care because of her declining mental state and poor judgment. "That's exactly what I told myself," the letter continued, "and it's exactly what you're telling yourself now. But poor judgment is often simply judgment that differs from ours, and declining mental state is often simply the natural result of aging in a culture that equates any cognitive change with incompetence." The letter then detailed, with clinical precision, every method I'd used to justify and execute my control over my mother's life, the evidence collection, the medical consultations, the family consensus building, the legal maneuvering. Each step I'd taken in 1987 was laid out alongside the corresponding step Catherine had taken in 2023. when I documented Mother's charitable giving as evidence of poor judgment. The letter explained, I was creating the same narrative you created when you documented my forgotten medication as evidence of safety concerns. When I convinced her doctor that she needed more support, I was using the same language you used to convince my doctor that I needed protection from myself. Mr. Patterson said Catherine had become increasingly agitated as the parallels became clear, insisting that her situation with me was completely different from my situation with her grandmother. Her concerns were medically validated, legally sound, and genuinely motivated by love and protection. That's what I told myself too, the letter responded. I genuinely believed I was protecting Mother from financial exploitation and safety risks. I convinced myself that her contentment at Heritage Gardens proved I'd made the right choice. I maintained my good intentions, even as I used her money for my own family's needs. Even as I kept her in care because I couldn't afford to return her assets to her control. This was the moment, according to Mr. Patterson, when Catherine realized where the letter was leading. She'd begun reading ahead, her face growing pale as she absorbed the full implications of what I was revealing. The power of attorney you encouraged me to sign allowed me to borrow funds from Mother's accounts for our family emergencies. The letter continued. Your conservatorship has allowed you to use my assets for house improvements and investments that will benefit your inheritance. Neither of us intended theft, but both of us engaged in it by convincing ourselves that someone else's money was ours to manage responsibly. Catherine had stood up at this point, Mr. Patterson reported, and begun pacing his office while demanding to know how I could compare her legitimate concerns about my welfare to what she was learning about my treatment of her grandmother. Because, the letter answered, you learned these methods from watching me use them. You learned that medical concern could justify taking someone's autonomy. You learned that families could make decisions for adults who were perfectly capable of making them for themselves. You learned that love could look like control and that protection could feel like imprisonment. The letter then revealed details about my mother's final years that I'd never shared with Catherine. How Mother had repeatedly asked to return home, but been told it wasn't safe. How she'd wanted to give money to her church, but been told her judgment about charitable giving couldn't be trusted. How she'd died believing that her own daughter saw her as incompetent and burdensome. I robbed Mother of her dignity while convincing myself I was preserving it. The letter continued. I stole her final years of independence while telling myself I was ensuring her safety, and I taught you, without meaning to, that this was what loving daughters do for aging mothers who can't be trusted to make their own decisions. Mr. Patterson said Catherine had stopped pacing and was standing very still by his office window, staring out at the parking lot where I used to park when I came for my own legal consultations. The letter concluded with the choice I was offering her. You can continue the pattern I taught you. Maintaining control over my life and assets while convincing yourself it's protection rather than control. The legal documents support your authority. The medical evaluations validate your concerns, and your family consensus confirms your judgment. You have everything you need to keep me exactly where I am until I die. Just as I kept Mother exactly where she was until she died. Or you can break the cycle by acknowledging what we've both done, making amends where possible, and ensuring that this pattern of justified control ends with us rather than being passed on to the next generation. The choice is yours, Catherine, but make it with full knowledge of what you're choosing and what you're teaching your own children about how families treat each other when independence becomes inconvenient. Have you ever had a moment when someone forced you to see yourself clearly, and you didn't like what you saw? The most powerful education often comes through recognition rather than instruction. Sometimes the best gift we can give someone is the mirror that shows them who they've become. Mr. Patterson said. Catherine had sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes after he finished reading, staring at the letter as if she could make its contents change through concentration alone. Then she'd asked the question I'd been waiting for her to ask. What exactly does she want me to do now? Catherine's question, what exactly does she want me to do now, revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what I was offering her. She was looking for instructions, for a clear path forward that would resolve the crisis without requiring her to fundamentally examine her own behavior. But that's not how boundary setting works, and it's not how pattern breaking works either. You can't be told how to change. You have to choose to change because you've finally seen clearly what needs changing. Mr. Patterson had explained that the letter contained no demands, no ultimatums, no specific actions Catherine needed to take to claim her inheritance. Instead, it offered her information and invited her to decide what to do with that information. The will stands as written, the letter concluded. Your inheritance is secure, regardless of what you choose to do next. But your integrity, your relationship with your own children, and your peace of mind are not secure. Those depend entirely on whether you can acknowledge what you've learned about yourself and what you choose to do with that knowledge. Catherine left the attorney's office that Tuesday morning carrying copies of both the will and the letter. But according to Mr. Patterson, she seemed to be carrying something much heavier than paper documents. She didn't come to see me that day, or the next. In fact, she stayed away from Sunset Manor for nearly 2 weeks, the longest absence since she'd had me committed 7 months earlier. During those 2 weeks, I waited. Not passively waiting. At my age is a strategic activity. I used the time to prepare for whatever conversation would eventually come, to think through the various ways Catherine might respond to the mirror I'd forced her to look into. She could reject the parallels entirely, convincing herself that her situation with me was fundamentally different from my situation with my mother. She could acknowledge the similarities but justify continuing the current arrangement as necessary despite its uncomfortable origins, or she could recognize that the pattern needed to be broken and find the courage to break it. I hoped for the third option, but prepared for all three. What I didn't anticipate was the emotional complexity of her eventual response. When the call came on a Friday evening, Catherine's voice was different. Quieter, less certain, stripped of the professional confidence I'd grown accustomed to over the past months. Mom, she said, I need to talk to you about the letter. But first I need to talk to you about David. This surprised me. My son had been notably absent from most of the conservatorship proceedings after that initial transition meeting. David called me yesterday, Catherine continued. He said he's been feeling guilty about supporting the conservatorship petition because he never really believed you were incompetent. He said he went along with it because I seemed so certain, and because the medical evaluations supported my concerns, but that he's always had doubts. I remained silent, letting her process what she was discovering about family dynamics and the weight of appearing certain when others have doubts. He asked me if I was sure I was doing the right thing, Catherine said. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I couldn't give him a definitive answer. The most powerful moments of growth often come when we realize we're teaching lessons we don't want our children to learn. Breaking family patterns requires acknowledging that we've perpetuated them, even when we had good intentions. Comment boundaries if you've recognized that your behavior was modeling something you didn't want to pass on. Made my decisions easier to justify. Just like you convinced yourself grandma was declining because it made your decisions easier to justify. This was progress, but recognition without accountability is just intellectual exercise. And what do you understand about the money, Catherine? Another pause. Longer this time. I understand that I've been using your assets for improvements that benefit me, while telling myself I'm protecting your investment. Just like you used grandma's money for family needs while telling yourself you were managing it responsibly. And what do you understand about the choice you're facing now? I understand that you're asking me to give up control over someone I've convinced myself can't be trusted with control. This was the crucial moment. Catherine had identified the pattern, acknowledged her participation in it, and recognized the choice. But understanding and choosing are different things entirely. What are you afraid will happen if you give me back my autonomy? I asked. I'm afraid you'll make decisions I think are wrong, she said quietly. I'm afraid you'll spend money in ways I wouldn't spend it. I'm afraid you'll trust people I wouldn't trust. And what does that tell you about whether your control is necessary or convenient? It tells me that my control is about my comfort, not your safety. We talked for over an hour that night. Catherine asked questions about my mother's final years, about the moments when I'd recognized that my protection had become imprisonment, about the guilt I'd carried for decades, about decisions I couldn't undo. She also asked practical questions about what would happen if she relinquished conservatorship. How would I manage complex financial decisions? What safeguards could be put in place to prevent actual exploitation? How could she maintain appropriate involvement in my life without crossing the line into control? These were better questions than I'd expected. They suggested that Catherine was thinking beyond the immediate crisis toward sustainable solutions that honored both my autonomy and her legitimate concerns about my welfare. But the conversation that really mattered came 3 days later, when Catherine arrived at Sunset Manor unannounced and asked to speak privately in my room. She looked exhausted, as if she'd been wrestling with demons for weeks. Which, in a sense, she had been. Mom, she said, sitting in the chair where she'd explained so many decisions about my life over the past months. I need to tell you what I've realized about myself, and I need to ask for your forgiveness. What followed was one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had. Catherine acknowledged that her concern for my welfare had been genuine, but had gradually been overtaken by her desire to control outcomes she couldn't predict. She admitted that she'd convinced herself I was more impaired than I actually was because it justified decisions she wanted to make anyway. Most importantly, she recognized that she'd learned these patterns from watching me, and that continuing them would teach her own children that family love looked like taking control when independence became inconvenient. I don't want Emma and James to do to me what I've done to you, she said, referring to her teenage children. I don't want them to learn that this is how families solve problems when someone gets older. The most powerful moments of growth often come when we realize we're teaching lessons we don't want our children to learn. Breaking family patterns requires acknowledging that we've perpetuated them, even when we had good intentions. Have you ever recognized that your behavior was modeling something you didn't want to pass on? But recognition and accountability, while necessary, weren't sufficient. Catherine still had to choose what to do with her new understanding, and that choice would determine whether our family's pattern of justified control ended with us or continued into the next generation. What do you want to do now? I asked her. I want to find a way to give you back your life, while still being able to help when you actually need help, she said. But I don't know how to do that without risking the mistakes I'm afraid you'll make. That's the difference between support and control, I told her. Support accepts that the person you're helping has the right to make mistakes. Control tries to prevent mistakes by removing the right to make them. Catherine was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden where I'd spent so many hours over the past months, thinking about family patterns and the courage required to break them. I'm scared, she finally said. I'm scared of letting go of control, and I'm scared of the person I've become while having it. Fear is appropriate, I replied. Change should be frightening. Comfort with the status quo is how patterns perpetuate themselves. That afternoon, Catherine began the process of researching how to relinquish conservatorship while establishing appropriate support systems for my transition back to independence. It would take weeks of legal procedures and careful planning, but for the first time in months, we were working together rather than in opposition. The pattern that had controlled our family for decades was finally beginning to break. Now, sitting in the home I almost lost, I can tell you how this story ends. The conservatorship was terminated in January 2025. After extensive legal procedures and psychological evaluations that confirmed what people maintained all along, my capacity for independent decision-making had never been compromised by anything more serious than normal aging. The transition back to autonomy wasn't seamless. There were moments when Catherine struggled not to intervene in decisions she disagreed with, and moments when I had to resist the temptation to make choices simply to prove I could make them. Breaking patterns requires constant vigilance, especially when those patterns served psychological needs for both parties. But we established new boundaries based on support rather than control. Catherine helps me research complex financial decisions when I ask for her input. But she doesn't have access to make those decisions for me. She accompanies me to medical appointments when I want her there, but she doesn't speak for me or override my responses to doctors' questions. Most importantly, we've both learned to distinguish between legitimate offers of help and attempts to regain control. The difference lies not in the action being offered, but in how that action is received when declined. True support accepts no thank you gracefully. Control responds to no thank you with increased pressure and evidence about why the help is necessary, regardless of preference. This is one of the most important boundary lessons I can share. Pay attention to how people respond. When you decline their help, that response tells you whether their offer was about supporting you or controlling you. Comment boundaries if you've learned to recognize this difference in your own relationships. The financial cost of Catherine's education was significant. The legal fees for establishing and then terminating conservatorship exceeded $30,000. The costs of keeping me at Sunset Manor for 7 months added another $42,000. The emotional cost was higher. Months of family tension, damaged trust that required active repair, and the ongoing work of examining family patterns that neither of us had recognized before the crisis forced recognition. But the alternative cost, continuing a pattern that would inevitably damage the next generation, was far higher. Catherine's children, Emma and James, are now 20 and 18 respectively. They watched their mother learn to apologize for decisions made with good intentions but harmful outcomes. They observed her choosing vulnerability over authority when admitting she'd been wrong about my capacity. Required acknowledging she'd been wrong about her own judgment. More importantly, they learned that family love doesn't require taking control when someone's choices become inconvenient or frightening. They learned that support and control are not the same thing, that protection and imprisonment are not equivalent, and that good intentions don't automatically justify harmful actions. These are lessons I failed to teach Catherine 38 years ago, when she watched me systematically dismantle her grandmother's autonomy, while convincing myself I was protecting her welfare. David, my son, has also been part of our family's healing process. He admitted that he'd supported Catherine's conservatorship petition not because he believed I was incompetent, but because Catherine seemed so certain and he didn't want to be the one responsible if something happened to me. I learned that it's easier to go along with someone else's certainty than to trust my own doubts. He told us during one of our family discussions about the events of the past year. But that kind of passivity enables patterns to continue when they should be questioned. The letter I'd written for Catherine to find has become a family document that we've shared with Emma, James, and David. Not to burden them with our mistakes, but to help them recognize warning signs in their own future relationships and decision-making processes. How will we know if we're becoming like what you describe? Emma asked during one of our family discussions about the events of the past year. You'll know because you'll start convincing yourself that someone's choices aren't safe, rather than accepting that they're not the choices you would make, Catherine replied. And you'll know because the person you're helping will start pulling away from you, rather than trusting you with their real thoughts and feelings. The most lasting change happens when we teach the next generation to recognize these dynamics before they become entrenched. Comment boundaries if you're committed to breaking patterns in your family rather than passing them on. This is what pattern breaking looks like in practice. Conscious recognition of warning signs, active resistance to familiar justifications, and willingness to prioritize relationship over control even when control feels safer. The house renovations Catherine had planned were never completed. Instead, I've made smaller modifications that support aging in place, while maintaining the character of the home where I raised my children. Catherine provides input when I ask for it, but the decisions and the financial responsibility remain mine. My real estate empire has been restructured to include more liquid assets and clearer succession planning, not because Catherine demanded it, but because I recognized the wisdom of making my wishes explicit, while I'm still capable of making them clearly. The relationship between Catherine and me is different now, more honest, more respectful, and paradoxically closer despite the reduction in her control over my daily life. We talk more frequently than we did before the crisis, but the conversations are about our thoughts and feelings, rather than my compliance with her recommendations. Most importantly, Catherine has become an advocate for other families struggling with similar dynamics. She speaks at elder law conferences about the difference between protection and control, helping adult children recognize when their concern for aging parents crosses the line into unjustified intervention. The hardest part, she tells these audiences, is admitting that your motivation for taking control isn't as pure as you want to believe it is. Most of us genuinely want to protect our parents, but we also want to prevent them from making choices that scare us, or cost us money, or require us to accept that they're different people than they used to be. The document you've heard me describe, the will and letter that forced Catherine to confront her own behavior, has been rewritten. Not because the lessons it contained were wrong, but because they're no longer necessary. Catherine has learned what she needed to learn, and our family has broken the cycle that controlled us for generations. The new will is simpler, focused on financial distribution rather than psychological education. But attached to it is a letter for Emma and James, explaining what their mother and I learned about family love, appropriate boundaries, and the difference between support and control. Comment Catherine if you'd like to hear how this felt from the daughter's side. The psychological journey from justified concern to devastating self-recognition, because the most important inheritance we can leave the next generation isn't money or property. It's the knowledge of how to love each other without controlling each other, how to offer help without demanding acceptance of it, and how to honor both autonomy and relationship even when they seem to be in conflict. That knowledge, passed down consciously, rather than accidentally, is the only way to ensure that family patterns serve connection rather than control. It's the only way to break cycles that damage relationships while convincing themselves they're preserving them. And it's the only way to teach the next generation that true family love looks like freedom to choose, even when those choices are different from the ones we would make ourselves. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with your own family experiences, I hope it helps you recognize patterns before they become problems. Subscribe for more stories about navigating the delicate balance between love and autonomy in our most important relationships. The pattern ends here. The cycle breaks with us, and the next generation inherits wisdom instead of wounds.